Sure. Hi, a very good evening to everyone. My name is Pramati, and I work as an associate of the Belong Research Collective, and I welcome you all to the third day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference, which is an initiative of Belong. I would like to warmly welcome all our panelists for today, and a huge warm welcome to Shobhini as well, along with our moderator from JPAL, Alison. We're really pleased to have you with us. A little bit about Belong. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identities, such as caste, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. We run programs for three major verticals: Research Collective, Mental Health, and Literature Collective. And this specific event is being held under the Research Collective banner. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. A little bit about the xSDG UnConference, of which this is the third day, and as a part of which we are holding this panel discussion. The UnConference is a part of one of our major initiatives at Belong called the xSDG, in which X stands for intersectionality, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive development. At xSDG, we've been curating resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that are focused on development through the lens of intersectional identities. And you can check all this out further at www.xsdg.dev. We have plans to host some podcasts around these themes as well as to create a space for people who are like-minded to join this platform in the future, especially through this UnConference. The UnConference is being held in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, Breakthrough India, and of course, JPAL South Asia. We have about 15 plus panels, which are running from the 18th to the 31st of August. And so far, these panels are ranging on a whole host of issues, ranging from SDG programming and funding, which can better address the needs of people who are facing prejudice due to their gender, sexual orientation, race, caste, faith, disability, age, and so on and so forth. The UnConference will feature interactive sessions with leading thinkers, doers, funders, and development experts working across SDG topics, and will seek to shape concrete initiatives that can get implemented going forward. And it is bringing together really exciting speakers such as you all to explore different aspects of these topics. If you wish to learn more about these different sessions, as well as our schedule, I'll be putting it in the chat box below. And please feel free to write to us at xsdg@belong.net. I now hand it over to Shobhini to take it forward from here and to walk us through the details of the panel and what we have in store for us.
Thank you, Pranati. Hello and welcome to today's discussion on inclusive SDG programming within fragile environments. We are joined by experts from across the world who will be sharing their experiences and insights with us over the next 1.5 hours. As Pranati mentioned, this is part of a series of conversations that JPAL South Asia is collaborating with Belong, Dalberg Advisors, and Breakthrough India to host the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference on designing inclusive social programs and policies to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So to this end, JPAL South Asia will host 5 virtual panels, which will attempt to identify the gaps in research and policy making in relation to disadvantaged groups, along with proposals to make them more inclusive. So before I get into this panel, just a very brief overview of other JPAL panels over the week to watch out for. So tomorrow, Tuesday, August 24th, we have the gender mainstreaming panel on centering women in policy making. 25th August, Wednesday, we have the xSDG research showcase, identifying and mitigating prejudice, partnering with Ideas for India to present over 10 insights from over 10 innovative research papers, exploring the links between identity and discrimination. On August 26th, we have a panel on research to action on designing inclusive policies. And the last panel on August 27th is designing exclusive MEL systems for SDGs on measurement, innovations, and challenges. So today's moderator for the panel on inclusive SDG programming within fragile environments is Alison Fahe. So Alison leads JPAL's newest regional office based at the American University in Cairo as the interim executive director of JPAL Middle East and North Africa. She contributes in guiding strategy and growth for the office's research, policy, capacity building, and operations teams, and forging partnerships for evidence generation and use with innovative policymakers across the MENA region. Alison also anchors the Governance, Conflict, and Crime Initiative, a research and policy program that supports JPAL's Crime and Violence Initiative, JPAL's Governance Initiative, and our partner organization, Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA's Peace and Recovery Program. And prior to joining JPAL in 2014, Alison worked in a variety of positions related to service delivery, economic growth, and decentralization with USAID in Afghanistan and Jordan, and with the World Bank in Indonesia. So with this, I hand it over to Alison to kickstart the discussion today and introduce the panel and the panelists. Thank you. Over to you, Alison.
Great. Thanks very much, Shobani, and thanks to our hosts from JPAL South Asia, Belong, Dalberg, and Breakthrough India. So welcome to our virtual audience who I guess are here with us on Zoom, also live streaming on Facebook and probably on several other platforms. Thank you for being with us for this panel discussion on inclusive SDG programming in fragile environments. Before we get started, a quick note on Q&A. We will have time with the panelists at the end to answer your questions. So we welcome your questions in a couple of different ways. First, through the chat box here. So as questions come up, feel free to just type them in and I'll keep an eye on what's coming through there. Or when we get to the Q&A session, you're welcome to raise your hand and just unmute, raise your Zoom hand and unmute and just ask your question verbally. And I'll look to our colleagues at Belong to see if there are questions coming in from the Facebook live stream, if you can pass those to me as well. So with that covered, let's dive in. In the past several decades, the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty has reduced dramatically from 42% 40 years ago to 11% in 2013. And on so many other dimensions of well-being, life around the world is improving. Fragility, conflict, and violence, however, directly threaten development goals. And indeed, FCV is increasingly associated with poverty. By 2030, estimates suggest that 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will be living in countries affected by fragility, conflict, or violence. Looking today at our world, this year, an estimated 235 million people will be in need of humanitarian assistance. And globally, UNHCR currently reports that there are a historic high of 82.4 million forcibly displaced people around the world, 80% of whom are living in low and middle income countries. And as we watch new chapters in the crisis in Afghanistan unfold right now, these numbers may well continue to rise. So this really stark reality is in tension with global ambitions around sustainable development. Indeed, the countries that are the furthest away from achieving sustainable human development are typically those most affected by violence and conflict. The preamble of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes this risk, saying there can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. In recognition of this fact, the 16th SDG articulates the need for building peace, justice, and strong institutions. And we will soon hear from our panelists about how each of them is working towards this goal across a range of settings and in a number of different ways. In complementing this focus on addressing fragility, conflict, and violence and building peace are a couple of SDG principles that I want to focus on a bit in today's discussion. And these principles are leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. So I'd like us to dig into that a little bit more today. What does it mean in practice, whether we are designing, implementing, evaluating, or funding programs in fragile and conflict-affected settings? And this is really the main objective of our discussion today. We want to hear from the panelists gathered together today about how they approach the diverse set of circumstances, opportunities, capabilities, and needs of people who are in humanitarian crises or who've been forcibly displaced. The failure to account for such differences and diversity that exist among those in need of humanitarian assistance could potentially impact the overall effectiveness of humanitarian programming. So this raises a question for us. How can programming be more nuanced, be more targeted, be more adaptive, and be more intersectional to the theme of this conference? How can humanitarian programming take an intersectional lens that accounts for the different experiences and needs of subgroups like social class, gender, disability, race, ethnicity, as these characteristics both affect how people experience crisis and conflict and may affect whether and how response programs actually meet their specific needs or maybe don't. So we'll dig into that more with the panelists who are here together. But before we turn to the panel, I want to share a few initial reflections on the approach of my organization, JPAL, or the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and how I think it fits into this conversation. So as you may have heard in other panels, given that JPAL South Asia is one of our hosts today, JPAL is a global research and policy center that works to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by rigorous evidence. So at the heart of our work is the use of randomized evaluations of programs in the real world, always conducted in partnerships with the organizations who design and implement these programs. And together we're working to understand what works and what doesn't, and how can we get that evidence used in decision-making. For nearly 20 years, this approach has been applied in every major sector in development, generating useful and applicable policy lessons in education, in healthcare, good governance, labor markets, and other sectors. And in recent years, and I think this is something especially exciting and relevant to our discussion today, there's been a growing focus on applying this same approach, the use of randomized evaluations, to working with partners in the humanitarian sector. So as JPAL Worldwide, our vision is to try to help improve the effectiveness of humanitarian programming by working with the extraordinary partners who are working in the field to generate more evidence about what really works. So looking at the body of research that exists related to humanitarian programming, research so far is tending to focus on a few key areas, and we're really excited to try to increase the evidence base available. So one of the key areas that we think is really important and where we're already learning a bit is around how to improve the effectiveness of humanitarian programming by identifying appropriate approaches and identifying appropriate delivery mechanisms. And these, of course, have implications for both the economic and non-economic outcomes of humanitarian assistance, as well as the ability of the humanitarian sector to really serve well the needs of vulnerable populations. So as a quick example here, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, researchers compared the effectiveness of cash to voucher transfers as a means of delivering assistance to communities affected by conflict and to internally displaced people. And in that case, they found that cash was more cost-effective than vouchers. So this helps to inform kind of this policy question around when is cash more appropriate and how do we think about the trade-offs around cash assistance. A second major area of focus in the research is around sustainability. As conflicts sort of increase in duration and humanitarian assistance is increasingly embedded in and really expected to serve longer term development objectives, what are the best models for trying to facilitate access to and take up of basic services? And so here there's a range of research looking at the impact on access to housing, access to mental health services, access to a whole host of different services, both in the immediate and in the long term. And a third area of focus is around protection aimed at reducing and preventing violence. And you'll hear an example of a study that kind of falls under this category from Turkey later in this panel. So overall, as JPAL, we are really eager to try to help bring more evidence into the difficult decisions around how to invest scarce resources most effectively, ultimately working to improve outcomes and contribute to sustainable development and peace. I think our approach also makes a few useful contributions to some of the core questions of this panel around how programming can be more inclusive and meet the needs of what is really actually a very diverse population. So I'll walk through a few things sort of from a process perspective. First, our evaluations are developed by our affiliated professors together with implementing partners. And together, we usually conduct qualitative research before designing a program and designing an evaluation to ask, What challenge is the partner really trying to address here? What solutions might make sense? But also, how does the experience of the problem or the applicability of the solution potentially vary for different kinds of people? We then pair that qualitative work with theory to inform how we anticipate what a program's effects might be and how we'll ultimately design the impact evaluation. Why and how might a program have different effects on different kinds of people? And then ultimately we'll design an impact evaluation that's structured in a way that will actually be able to answer those questions about the differential impacts of a program on different people. So research has an important role to play. You'll hear more about that today, as does the work of program design, implementation, and funding. And so today's panel offers us a great opportunity to hear from people who are working in diverse geographies and tackling questions of inclusive and tailored programming from different and really complementary perspectives. So I'll introduce you to the panelists and then get on over to the questions. So we're going to open with the perspectives of implementing agencies who design and implement humanitarian, protection, and development programs in fragile contexts. So first we'll hear from Rifat bin Sattar, who is the Director of Program Development and Quality at Save the Children Bangladesh, where he focuses on child protection, child rights, climate and disaster, education, as well as a gender, inclusion, human rights, and governance kind of lens. We'll then hear from Eva Kaplan, who is the Regional Director of Innovation at the International Rescue Committee and the Airbelt Impact Lab in Jordan. She brings more than a decade of experience working with organizations, including Innovations for Poverty Action, PopTech, the Rockefeller Foundation, and UNICEF. We'll then shift to the perspective of a researcher working alongside implementers and really digging into questions about effectiveness. So our third panelist is Shula Allen, who is the Professor of Economics at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and an adjunct professor at Bilkent University. Her research primarily focuses on topics around household behavior, household finance, and she's also been conducting large-scale educational interventions across Turkey. She's also a JPAL-affiliated professor. And finally, we'll consider the role of philanthropy in inclusive SDG programming. Our final speaker, Amna Fatani, is Associate Director of Strategy for Community Jameel, an international organization tackling some of the world's most urgent challenges using a pioneering approach grounded in evidence, science, data, and technology. So I'm eager to hear from the group. So with that, why don't we jump right in to hear about how the panelists and their organizations approach designing, implementing, evaluating, and funding inclusive programming focused on peace and development. So Rifat, we'll start with you. The Rohingya crisis shows that a majority of the refugees are children, a vulnerable group in need of special protection and care. A large proportion of this refugee group are also young girls who are particularly vulnerable to other specific forms of exploitation and neglect. Can you share with us your experience working on the rehabilitation of Rohingya refugees? Keeping in mind the key constraints that the communities face in rebuilding their lives, how do we ensure that humanitarian programming is informed by a sound understanding of the different impacts that conflict can have on women, girls, and boys, and on people with other diverse identities in the affected population?
Thanks, Alison, for, I think it's a very valid question, given the context that you just started with. And thanks, JPAL, for this interesting topic, inclusive SDG programming, and having me here as a panel. I think the Rohingya crisis that you just particularly was asked about is not a recent crisis. I mean, it has been a decade-long crisis. I mean, from 70s, late 70s, we have seen this migration from Myanmar to Bangladesh and so on and so forth for the Rohingya refugee population. And that has been a constant, I would say, denial from the state in terms of their citizenship and so on. So that's why they have always been vulnerable situation in their own country or in the original country. But the recent influx that we see right now as a crisis is in 2017, when a large number of Rohingya refugees fled to Bangladesh, given the atrocities in Myanmar, which the UN Human Rights Council chief nicely said as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. So we know all about the atrocities, and this really says how vulnerable a community could be, a citizen could be, and they can push into a very difficult situation. And when they fled to Bangladesh in 2017 August, in 25th August, basically the influx started. Just 2 years from the we are just going to as of the 4-year mark after 2 days. So it was a I mean, the three main problems that we saw in that point of time was trauma, because quite naturally the children and women, in many cases, they were separated from their families, especially since the men were severely beaten or killed in Myanmar. So we saw a huge number of children unaccompanied and separated from their families when they are traveling by boat. And trauma was one of the major criteria, because major situation, because they were all traumatized seeing the violence. And then certainly life-saving assistance was one of the priority at that point of time. And all the NGOs, humanitarian committee were up there doing the humanitarian assistance. Save the Children was one of the few NGOs who were already in Rohingya refugee camp or the Cox's Bazar since 2012. We are working with the registered camp. So we had the advantage to work directly as a first responder because we are already present, and we are one of the few NGOs who are already there. So we started with the life-saving assistance quite naturally. And we started with the typical food security situation, food security, wash, shelter, education, child protection, and health and nutrition. These were the major areas that we have been intervening. But from our experience for last 4 years, or even I would say the first 2 years, our main observation I would say is that the resilience that we have seen from the Rohingya community, because after this tremendous atrocity they have faced in Myanmar, then they have traveled long way over the sea through boat, very difficult circumstances. Then they came here in a completely different scenario, different situation, different structure, different culture, and they adapted it very well. And their local structure, the community structure has also broken. So even in that situation, they have shown tremendous resilience, and that's why even these 4 years they are surviving against all the odds that they have faced. So I think that is the best part of the whole response, and the way they have responded to the, I would say, the Rohingya refugee responded to the whole crisis, the support that the humanitarian committee has been providing. I think that was I would say the major striking point from the humanitarian committee point of view. Into the sector response, yes, certainly there was a good coordination mechanisms out there, and that's why all the humanitarian committee we could start working there. But your main question was about the effect that the community have that faced or experienced, especially the children and the girls. So as I already mentioned, is that children were vulnerable because of the trauma experience traumatic experience they've experienced, and also there were a lot of children unaccompanied and separated. So initially, one of the major response activity was to really unify them with their family members if they are available, or with their kinship, nearest kinship, or initially we kept them in a safe space where, so that we can really keep them in a safe environment, so that gradually we can unify them with their, as I said, with their family and kinship. And for the girls, certainly it was a big issue. Still, it is a big issue because there's a security situation there. There's a huge protection risk there, especially for the girls. And we also see a lot of early marriage happening for the girls because of this security issue. So certainly, as you are just mentioning, is that certainly adolescent girls, I would say, is that they're disproportionately impacted by the whole crisis. Even if you look at the women, for many reasons, as we know, that whenever there is a big crisis, usually the women, children, they are the most vulnerable. And in this case also, it was the same. But your another question was about informed understanding of humanitarian programming. So one of the big gap, I would say, from our experience for the last 4 years is that we still lack robust needs assessment. Though there is a regular process of needs assessment, but in many cases, needs assessment is not disaggregated data. We don't have disaggregated data. So for whatever reason, I mean, we have needs assessment process, but somehow the disaggregation is not available. So that's why sometimes it's very difficult to really have informed programming for the most vulnerable population, like children, women, girls, or even persons with disabilities. So I think that's a big gap that we have. But even compared to other organizations, Sub-Digital is sort of doing good in terms of having disaggregated data or having robust needs assessment whenever we are doing a programming. Another dimension to it, I would say, is the accountability mechanisms that we have in place. Most of the organizations have that mechanism in place, including Save the Children. We have a very robust mechanisms in place, which also allows us to constantly hear from the communities what their needs are, and also what's their feedback about the interventions that's happening. And also that allows us to really course correct our measures, improve our support assistance based on their feedback. And we really have a very robust mechanism, and regularly we get the feedback over phone there's a desk there. We have other mechanisms like post-distribution monitoring. Whenever we are distributing food assistance, we really go to them, ask them whether they're happy with the food support and other stuff. So there's a constant interaction with the community on the ground, and that's also creates the opportunity for engaging them in a different programming. It's not only hearing from the feedback, but also the humanitarian community have been engaging them, getting them participated in different processes, and that's also build their ownership in whatever the humanitarian response is happening there. So from that point of view, I would say that definitely there's a lot more to do, since it's a huge operations that we're running, about 1.1 million refugee in a very small place, congested, one of the, I think, most congested camps that we have in the world. But there is a coordinated sector response, I would say, given all these odds, as I mentioned, some data disaggregation, identifying the most vulnerable, and all those things. That's always a challenge in this case. Just one comment at the end is that you started with the comment is that rehabilitation of the refugee population, which I would say is a big difference in this case, because as we know, this crisis is not something only between Myanmar and Bangladesh. It's a global crisis, and it doesn't only, humanitarian assistance is not going to help the problem, resolve the problem. The problem is much more deep-rooted, because as I initially mentioned, it's ethnic cleansing. So the solution have to be durable, and we are constantly saying, both the humanitarian community, the UN, even the global community are saying is that there are 4 criteria that we are talking about. It has to be voluntary return, safe return, dignified return, and they have to return to the origin where they came from, not to the camps. We really expect them that if they're returning, they have to return to their own original place, not to their camps again in Myanmar. So they are the 4 criteria that we've been pushing constantly by the humanitarian community, and that's where we want to aim for a durable solution. I think humanitarian assistance is not something that we are looking at as a longer term period. So that's why rehabilitation is not something that probably something that our government or in a greater I would say humanitarian community is really looking for that. But certainly we are doing a lot of stuff that can support their safe presence in the camps or secure stay in the camp. But still, I think the main ask is to have a durable solution along those 4 lines that I have just mentioned. I would pause there. I would be happy to have more questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. Yes, we'll invite the audience to put questions into the chat or to note them down and share them in a minute. So thanks so much, Rifat. And I think that's a nice transition into some of the questions that I want to pose next to Eva, especially thinking about some of the things that Rifat said about the importance of hearing from community and getting feedback to try to improve the nature of services. And so, Eva, we're really interested to hear from you on some of these topics. So the Airbelt Impact Lab, of course, invests in prototyping and testing potential solutions to humanitarian issues, starting with a human-centered approach to rethinking what are the needs, challenges, and potential solutions, and trying to design things from the outset for scale. So Eva, you're working in the context of a crisis, the humanitarian crisis in and around Syria that's more than a decade long, where the needs of the Syrian refugee community have shifted over the years and range very widely within a community that is 6.7 million people strong. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the human-centered design that is at the heart of the Airbelt approach really works? How does that work in practice? And it would be great if you could walk us through maybe one of the challenges that Airbelt opted to tackle, and tell us about the process of developing a new solution to meet that challenge, and how you got community members involved and what you've been learning from the process.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to talk mostly about our community design group, which is our main channel to kind of co-create solutions with community members. But first, I just kind of want to take a step back and just mention briefly what Airbelt does, and also a little bit about human-centered design. So I think probably most people are well aware of human-centered design and probably have engaged with it at some point, but just as a ground setting exercise, I'm still going to go through it. So the Airbelt Impact Lab is the research and innovation team within the International Rescue Committee. So I work in the Airbelt Impact Lab Middle East Hub. And so all of our work is, of course, across the Middle East. And we follow a pretty sort of standard innovation cycle, which is design, test, and scale. So at the early phases, this is a sort of interdisciplinary approach. At the early phases of a project in the design phase, we are leaning very heavily on design methodologies. And as we move through the innovation pipeline, our ambition is to do randomized controlled trials on all of our interventions. But I'm going to focus on the design phase. So essentially, a project typically starts with either defining a challenge with community members through kind of a participatory research, design research, or we may start out with a challenge coming from some other area. We will do a lot of scoping of that challenge, which will include evidence reviews and includes interviews with experts, both in the country that we're working in and globally, practitioners, policymakers, all of the stakeholders who are involved in that particular problem. And then, of course, the design approach is really focusing on the human beings who are impacted by the problem. So this is a critical type of expertise that we bring in, which is the sort of context expert. And essentially what we're seeking to do in this phase is understand what that challenge looks like from the perspective of the person experiencing it. And further, we really want to look at the existing attitudes, behaviors, and practices of the target beneficiaries. So obviously, there's no one answer to that. There's, as Allison mentioned, there's 6.7 million refugees in Jordan, Syrian refugees. There's close to 700,000. So there's no one answer to the existing attitudes, behaviors, and practices. But we do sort of create what we call personas or archetypes on some of the most common types of attitudes, behaviors, and practices that we might kind of come across, and try to differentiate that across different demographics and locations and things like that. So in this sense, our job is really to understand the experience of the people who are impacted by crisis. So from this foundational scoping research, we start to develop ideas for solutions. And really our goal here is to define something that solves a problem for all of the relevant stakeholders as they define their own problems. And so in some cases, they may actually define those problems very differently. So if you think about something like early marriage, that's something that is a big concern in this region. And if you speak to an expert that might be a colleague of mine, they'll really be talking about early childhood marriage as a problem in terms of being exploitative to young girls, and all of that is true. If you talk about a community member to a parent who has engaged in this practice, they describe that as a solution to a different problem, which is the lack of education opportunities and other opportunities that are available to their children in displacement. So they understand this problem very differently. And if we're going to, quote unquote, solve the challenge of early childhood development, we have to not only solve it from the perspective of my colleagues, the experts, but also from the perspective of the person who is experiencing the challenge. And those may have very different perspectives. So that's the first kind of tenet of our approach, is to solve the problem of all the stakeholders as they define the problem. The second is that our solutions should feel familiar and comfortable based on the existing practices. So we're not our intervention should not be introducing something that expects a radical change in behavior. It should be something that leverages existing behaviors to the extent possible. So once we sort of have this idea in mind, a few ideas, we develop a number of them, we test them. And we test them in a very small scale way through prototyping. So that starts literally just with a drawing on paper, and we get feedback on that drawing. That's our first prototype. Once we have a lot of feedback, people have highlighted the risks, come up with solutions or ideas on how to mitigate those risks. Then we start to test it and we start to implement it in a really small way, focusing on potentially even just 2 or 3 people to start, and we grow over time. And this is kind of how we do our prototyping. One thing I want to emphasize that at this stage in the prototyping, we're not really testing for impact. Actually, we're not testing at all for impact. What we're testing is for value to the end user. So what we want to know at this point is, for all of the stakeholders who are engaging in this intervention, do they like it? Does it, again, solve the problems as they define them? Does it work for them? And if the answer is yes, then our next question is to say, okay, we know that people like it, but does it actually work? And that's when we would move into an impact evaluation methodology. So that's kind of the broad outline of what we do. So I'm just going to go kind of quickly through how we work with community members in this process. So that's the human-centered design process, but we sort of do this through a co-creation process at every step of the way. So we work with a network of community designers. They've been trained in human-centered design, psychological first aid, sensitive referral mechanisms, research ethics, and more. So they lead our design research with us. So the way it typically works is that I will scope out a project, either with my IRC colleagues or with other colleagues. And then our lead designer will work with the community design group to scope out, okay, how are we actually going to approach this? They lead all the field research. We do our ideation workshops together. We really co-create the types of solutions we want to prototype. And then the community design group leads the prototyping in the field. So the community design group comes from a range of backgrounds, a range of different refugee communities. They represent different refugee communities who live here in Jordan, including Syrian, but also Yemeni, Iraqi, Sudanese, and of course, Jordanians. And sometimes our community designers are actually not very representative of the problems that we're seeking to work through. So for example, some things we've done with teachers, we don't have teachers in the community design group. So what we'll do is we actually recruit a network of teachers as well, and they work with our community design group, and then again, co-create the solution. So we've done that with a patients advocacy group and so people who have experienced the mental health system here in Jordan. We've worked with them to co-design solutions, and the community design group. And so this is kind of how we do our designing of interventions in our work. And I think I'll stop there because I think that was my time. So.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, we can come back to maybe digging into some more examples in a moment. So now I want to shift focus a little bit to the perspective that evaluating programs can bring to shedding light on what works in which ways for which kinds of people. So next I want to shift to Shula Allen. Shula, the aspect of your research that we want to talk about today focuses on integrating Syrian refugee children into schools in Turkey and explores the impact of an interactive classroom program that involves the concept of perspective taking. So can you speak a little more about the motivation of you and your partners in choosing to implement and evaluate perspective taking, and why you felt that this was an approach that could help to reduce prejudice among a diverse student body? And then can you tell us a bit about what you learned? How did it contribute to building social cohesion amongst the students? What are some of the factors that drove those outcomes? And did you run into any challenges while actually working with students, teachers, families on the ground, and how did you address those?
Okay, thank you. Do I have a time limit, or I'm not sure? I didn't.
You have 10 minutes. Excuse me, 7 minutes. 7
minutes to reflect on this. Okay, so that's okay. So I'll time myself, hopefully. I'll
give you a heads up if you're running over.
Yeah. So just like Eva was talking about how you can't design programs without having the right feedback, right sense from the community who's impacted by the shock you're trying to address. The research you're referring to, research I'm going to talk about today, is basically the manifestation of the importance of qualitative research in designing, implementing, and evaluating a social program. So the idea appeared not overnight. The idea came through talking to people who were affected by the Syrian civil war. It's Syrian refugees in Turkey, also the host communities. So all the stakeholders who were in daily challenge, actually, who were facing daily challenges. So this idea didn't come from me sitting in my office, oh, let me think about a program or see a program implemented and evaluate the program in a randomized control fashion. That did not happen. What happened was talking to these people, talking how they view international institutions in the field, how they view the incoming students refugee students in Turkish classrooms, and how the teachers were challenged by this. So just to give you a little bit of background on this, Turkey was truly challenged by this for many reasons. So the body of the refugees were a lot, so many children, so many adults, of course, all of a sudden in short period of time. And the Turkish government actually started implementing something good, right? Starting 2016 in an orderly fashion, putting these refugee children into school system, into Turkish school system. So like kind of a total immersion idea. So this is a good, really nice idea. I still like the idea very much. And I think it has a lot of potential. It's working. It's in some areas it's working. But the problem was in the field, what we noticed was teachers were not ready for this challenge. So the teachers were not that ready for this challenge. And everywhere we went and talked to these people quite informally, to be honest, they said, we really need a roadmap. What are we supposed to do with 3 children who came from a trauma setting in a very difficult conflict setting, who does not speak the local language? By the way, Turkish is very, very different from Arabic. A lot of you would know. It's a very different language. So what should we do? Tell us what to do so we could do this. So this is how this research started, talking to the people who are dealing with the issue. And then we did start talking to education experts, the social psychologists, even at the development stage, even with the real children content developers. So we thought this, okay, what we could do now, we could approach this as a curricular approach. So what we could do is we could help these good teams, along with the Ministry of Education, develop certain curricular content to give it to teachers. So the teachers would implement this along with what they're implementing every day, right? And then we see if this is working. The idea actually was very welcomed by the teachers, by the local community. And then and the idea of perspective taking come from basically from social psychology literature. When we looked at this, of course, this was a great policy question. Any curricular movement, any curricular approach, could this actually build cohesion between the host community and the refugee community in the school environment? We are talking about host children and the refugee children. How can we do this? Can a curricular content do this with the help of a teacher? So when we ask this question, this is a great policy question, but the underlying this policy question, we decided to ask a great research question. And the research question was a lot more narrow, saying that, how about perspective taking? Because in the core of all these conversations in the qualitative research, what we see is a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of miscommunication, a lot of not understanding each other. That's why we call this project Understanding Each Other Project. So basically, in all conflict settings, the parties not listening to each other, not trying to understand, not understanding each other's point of view, not trying to understand or not hearing the other party's point of view is an adult thing. For children are not biased. Children are ready to absorb any material you would like to give them. So how about teaching them perspective taking? How about teaching them cognitive empathy, developing their cognitive empathy through developing their social skills? They are receptive, they are open. My previous research says it is possible in the school environment. You can actually develop social and emotional skills with the help of a teacher if you use correct pedagogical and correct curricular interventions. So that's how it started. The curricula was developed by really talented people. We train the teachers, knowing the perspective taking is a great feature of a human being, because also in the social psychology literature, we know in a correlational evidence way, we know that it's associated with lower violence, it's associated with higher trust and prosociality. So we went for it. We implemented in the field in highly inflicted schools, like with a lot of refugee population, and then we evaluated the program. We found great results, great short-term results, and the short-term results, when we developed this program, one innovative part of this program was how narrow it was, how it was informed from the local implementers, the teachers. But the second innovative part was the way we measure outcomes. So we decided to measure a wide, comprehensive outcomes, a lot of outcomes, not just violence, but also through surveys and tests, how these kids develop trust, how they reciprocate each other's trust, how altruistic they become. And on top of it, I wasn't just interested in mere tolerance of the other. So the idea in the perspective taking is understanding the other, the person who is not looking like you, not thinking like you, not sitting or eating like you. So that's the idea. How do you approach to that? It's not, you could just think about mere tolerance, I tolerate you, but I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to go and make sure that these children become friends with each other, really love each other, right? So that was the idea. So we measure in the end friendship, interethnic friendships, interethnic relationships through through network designs. So we see great positive results from this intervention after 1 year, short-term results. Long-term results we couldn't get because of COVID, but we are onto it now because the schools are opening. We are going to follow these kids and see if they are still trusting each other, if they are still forming interethnic friendships, which I care about a lot. To me, the integration and the cohesion means interethnic relationships. Without just saying, okay, you're with me, I'm going to tolerate you. Beyond that, we just have to be in social relationships. So I would like to measure that next time I'm in the field. So hopefully the long-term results are going to be promising as well. Challenges, Alison, you mentioned challenges. Of course, this is a field work in a very difficult setting where the host community has different views about the refugees coming. The refugee community have different challenges. That is why the qualitative research was important. That is why we had to hear both sides and see the miscommunications. What was required, what kind of program was required, and because so many programs you can think of, but the issue is which ones could be possibly be successful. And then that's why it was important to talk to those and see a lot of challenges and design a program that actually navigates those challenges. What we are saying is this is not the only program which could do this in the schools, but it is one of the successful programs that we know now that we can actually take it to scale.
That's
so
great.
should I stop here?
Yeah, I think I'll stop you there and we'll have a chance to come back to thinking more about paths to scale and policy implications.
Okay.
But so that we don't cut into our Q&A time too much, next I want to turn to Amna, but Shula, thanks so much for that overview. We'll all closely be following the long-term results once you're able to get back to the field. So Amna, Community Jamil takes a collaborative approach working with research institutions like JPAL and grassroots organizations in the field to improve programming. Can you talk a bit about your organization's philosophy of using evidence, data, science, and technology to try to power innovations in these areas? And in particular, how this has shown up in Community Jamil's work with vulnerable populations and in fragile settings or settings facing political or climate crises. Can you talk a bit about your overall reflections on your approach and maybe some initial thoughts on the impact of investments from the perspective of a philanthropy?
Thanks, Alison, and thank you to JPAL South Asia as well for hosting this panel. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think Community Jamil, if you think about our approach, it's really driven by a mission to help communities around the world really adapt to all the changes that are happening around the world, climate change, the future of work, the impact of automation, machine learning, and in this context, conflict. So our aspiration is to be able to really deliver programs that can help these communities strengthen their resilience and really respond to these changes or the challenges that they face. And we want to do that using the power of science, evidence, and technology, like you said. So in practice, what that means is essentially we fund kind of two different types of programs, what we call upstream and downstream programs. So upstream will fund researchers and research organizations like JPAL and scientists to really enable them achieve the breakthroughs that are needed in the areas of specialization. So almost kind of like translational work. And then we'll also work on the downstream to create the programs and anchor fund and leverage other funders to bring those breakthroughs where they're needed the most. So really our ethos is one of system strengthening. Our kind of core belief is that in order to drive impact at the systems level, we want to first approach challenges holistically. So that means that, thinking about what are the interdependencies, the root causes of issues, what are other areas of impact that could be achieved, and in a crisis context, obviously, and in a lot of other contexts, this is really complicated. And oftentimes it's really, really challenging because there is a need to respond quickly to a humanitarian crisis. And what we've seen is that, unfortunately, a lot of time these crises are protracted. And so the need for a long-term kind of systemic approach is really great. I'll give an example of one of our programs in Jordan, where, as you know, the influx of refugees after the Syrian or during the Syrian crisis created additional pressure on the Jordanian educational system. And we found that teachers became overwhelmed, managing classrooms over multiple shifts, dealing with a lot of trauma in their classrooms from the influx of refugees. It really led to increased pressure on children's mental health and their ability to be resilient, the teachers' mental health and their ability to be resilient. On both kind of, and when we talk about the students, both the refugee students and the host community students. So we worked with Save the Children in Jordan and the Jameel World Education Lab, which is another research lab that we fund at MIT, and collaborated to pilot what we think is a really innovative approach that could really potentially change the ability to improve teaching, both teaching and learning in refugee settings. In this particular case, the TREE program, we utilized an approach called the compassionate systems that draws on the innate compassion that teachers have, draws on their ability to use that compassion to understand and manage trauma and stress in the classroom. So the program itself is a teacher training program. But what we found from this program is not only are we now seeing that we're able to establish an approach that supports both teachers and children's well-being, but also improve learning outcomes for those children as well. And so these are the kinds of spillovers and the impact that you kind of want to see, where you kind of think about what the root cause of an issue is, where are you seeing the impact of that issue, what are the challenges that are being faced, and they're usually not one, they're usually multiple, and they're kind of interdependent. And how can we kind of design an approach that is both innovative, but can also have a lasting and systemic change? And that's really at the core of our philosophy and the way we work. I just kind of to say that this is, it's even in non-humanitarian settings, just kind of in regular development settings, this is often really difficult to achieve. And I think the work that JPAL does really shows that by investing in understanding more what's happening, why it's happening, potential impact of interventions that helps us scale up and scale down, that's how we've been able to see kind of lasting systemic change. And we think that there's, despite it being challenges, that there are levers that we can address in humanitarian context, in a crisis, in a conflict context, we're able to also kind of achieve a similar type of impact. So just to kind of echo what you shared in the beginning as well about the role that JPAL plays, I think it's a really at the core of our philosophy as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Amna. So we have about half an hour to go, and I want to save time for questions. There's already a good one in the chat box. So I'm going to shift a little bit from our initial plan to the panelists, and I want to shift to some of our questions, stepping back and thinking about kind of broader policy implications of the work. Although, Eva, I'm going to give you 30 seconds when it's your turn to talk a bit about the findings of one of the Airbelt examples. So Rifat, let's go back to you, though. You're operating in an already challenging policy environment, and then exacerbated massively by the pandemic. So can you talk a bit about how Save the Children is working to ensure, and what more broadly the humanitarian community should be doing to ensure that children continue to receive access to education, healthcare services, and other opportunities to secure their basic rights, and what is needed in the policymaking arena that's not happening right now? What else needs to be taking place?
Any time limit for me?
Yes, thanks for prompting me. Why don't we say like aim for 3 minutes, please? So big questions, short time, we'll have to be concise.
Yeah, when it comes to policy, it's always a big question, and especially when it comes to response. Yeah, I mean, certainly Save the Children is working directly or through partners in terms of access to basic services, like you said, education, health, child protection, and so on and so forth. But in terms of policy environment, I would say is that on one hand, we are having direct services to the communities, but on the other hand, we are also working closely with the government, because in general, Save the Children has a strong system component in whatever we are doing, both in development community, development sector, as well as in the humanitarian context. That's why we have a good relationship with the government. So that's why also it helps us to really work closely with the government in terms of system level work. But when it comes to refugee crisis or refugee situations, sometimes system don't work because national system doesn't work in that setting. So that's why we also work closely with the relevant duty bearers in that context. For example, in our context, there's a separate government designated person called Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner. So we have a very good relationship with him, and we are really working with him in terms of whatever we are doing. And not only us, basically all the humanitarian community there, they really get the approval, endorsement, and the guidelines from the government through RRC for the humanitarian sector interventions. And of course, we also have the sector coordination mechanisms, and we follow all the sector standards as is expected by the community. In a broader level, I would say is that we all know, I mean, refugee rights is a paramount issue. But there is a tendency for most of the domestic audiences, whenever there's a refugee crisis happens, is that usually the national governments or the domestic audiences, even the citizens, think that whenever we are providing services to the refugees, education, health, and other services and opportunities, it may be at the expense of the services and opportunities the citizens are entitled to. So they always think there is a trade-off between that. But in really, that's not the case, right? So I think the humanitarian community needs to play a role in that case to change the rhetoric. Is that whenever you are giving service to refugees, it's not at the expense of the citizens, but rather it's very much their right angle. So that we need to establish that argument. Also, we need to appreciate is that refugee is not something that they're coming by their choice. It's not like economic migrants that they're moving from one country to another for livelihood opportunities. It's completely they are by the compulsion, or they're by forced to take refugee to different countries. So that's why we need to push that the policy environment and as the advocacy at the global level is that, which I also mentioned in my earlier deliberation, is that whenever we are pushing for environment policies, we should opt for durable solutions, where we need to push that the return has to be in their own place of origin. So that is, I think, that should be the global push, which is not really a big happening at that stage. And I would say there is a big gap out there in terms of taking that discussion to that level. Certainly, the refugee crisis that we're dealing right now in Cox's Bazar with Rohingya refugees, there's a multiple parties involved in this whole crisis. It's very complex situation. It's not so easy. It's very complex. And there is not only a humanitarian interest, there is other interests as well by the global community. So that's why our government is trying from diplomatic channels. It's taking into the UN level, global level. But again, we are saying is that the human community, not only the children, but all the community, really pushing for a durable solutions. And that has been a push from the UNHCR and other UN bodies, and including the largest INGOs like Save the Children and other INGOs.
Okay, thanks, Rifat. So the continued importance of focusing on pushing for durable solutions. So perhaps not in and of itself a new concept, but a concept that absolutely must like remain on the table as we're simultaneously having a discussion around innovation. Eva, I want to now come back to you. So for just a few minutes, could you give us maybe like 1 minute high level, an example of a program, like what actually emerged from the prototyping and how is that different from what maybe the traditional program in response to that challenge might be? So that's part one. And part two is then, can you talk to us a little bit about like, what are the implications on an organization like IRC? You guys have been around for almost 100 years. This is a very new approach to designing programs. Like, how do you see the organization shifting and maybe more broadly, the whole sector shifting to try to incorporate the kind of community and human-centered approach and the community design group approach first? Is it scalable? Like, what does the future look like based on what you've seen? You're muted, Eva. And again, with all those questions, I'll give you like 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Okay.
If you could.
So I think there's a number of examples where what I would say is that we have approached things very differently than traditional practice, and also examples where we've optimized existing practice because existing practice is great, but there's things that could change again using a human-centered design approach. So I think there's both of those. One example, we have been doing a big project on mental health. And you know, someone mentioned in the chat trauma, it's obviously enormous. In Jordan, in the urban refugee populations, it's upwards of 60% of the population that are experiencing clinical distress. That's basically, what that means is that everyone is either experiencing distress or knows someone that's experiencing distress. And so our approach was really to say, okay, we can't look at this from an intervention perspective of like, we are developing a mental health intervention. We need to approach it as we need to have population level impact on mental health. So our target audience is 680,000 refugees who are living in Jordan. And that's a very different approach to a traditional program, which would be delivering a mental health intervention. Now, you can't choose between those. You have to have both. But our design approach did allow us to look at, again, existing help-seeking behaviors, existing information-seeking behaviors, and design something that is leveraging existing information-seeking behaviors to communicate messages around self-care practices, how to, when you, what might be, you know, defined as distress versus like having a bad day, and critically leveraging the, you know, a huge existing practice, which is that the first place people go when they are experiencing distress is their friends and family. It's not formal care. So a lot of our work is with friends and families and helping them structure the care that they're giving to their loved ones in a different way. So these are very different approaches than you would typically see. And again, it's based on our design research. How does this shift and is it scalable? I think the big shift is that the major shift in terms of a humanitarian organization is that we are no longer the people solving problems, which is what we do. We come into a crisis situation and we're problem solvers, right? Like that's what we do. Rather, what we're doing is we're really being mindful of the enabling space and creating a space for others to be able to solve problems. And again, when we think about sustainability, we're also thinking about the sustainability of that enabling space. So really saying we're empowering the community members that we're working with to be problem solvers now as they're working with us, and problem solvers in the future as they end their work with us. And that's a very different skill set. It's a very different mindset. It really changes everything about how we approach the work. And yeah, I'll end there.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Eva. Under 3 minutes. Next, Shula, I'll come back to you and picking up on a couple of the points that you closed on. So you mentioned perspective taking isn't, you know, the only solution, but it is one approach that we now know based on the research is effective. So I wonder if you can talk now about like, what are the policy implications of that lesson? What might efforts to try to scale this approach up in Turkey look like? And what would it take to really do that? And then if you can also think about other contexts where, I could see potential applicability of this approach in a number of other contexts, but what should organizations or ministries of education be thinking about in deciding if this could be a suitable part of the policy solution where they're operating and with the kids that they're serving?
Okay, so it's definitely not the only way to approach this. So first of all, we are targeting children only here and the schools. To be honest with you, to do this is basically I find it this was the easiest way to start this big problem, right? So impressionable ages and receptive teachers, we could actually design something. So the policy implications are large. Of course, this was a curricular approach with a little bit of pedagogy in it. Pedagogy in the sense that we actually, the approach taught the teachers how to be inclusive within their classroom practices. So you teach children how to put themselves into somebody else's shoes, right? And how do you do that? How do you embed this into the entire pedagogy when you're teaching maths, when you're teaching the language or any other things. So because we had real good short-term results, very positive results in a lot of dimensions, as I said before, that we measured the effectiveness of this policy, this curricular intervention with respect to a wide range of outcomes. We weren't just interested in violence itself. Violence was important, but we were also interested in friendship networks. We were also interested in social behavior, altruism, and all that stuff. So in all dimensions, we measured these children, and in every dimension, we have seen positive improvement. And I didn't mention before what we did not target was the language, learning Turkish. We did not think that this curriculum could help that, but we were wrong. We saw that there was an amazing help, because in the end, this curriculum implied that the host children and the refugee children just played with each other all the time and communicate with each other. That helped the refugee children learn Turkish way effectively. In terms of scale up, the program has to be scaled up, because at the time when we started this, there was no other program to give it to the teachers. In fact, when the teachers were hoping for a roadmap, there was nothing much targeting both host and refugee children. There were lots of programs targeting refugee children in this setting, but nothing embracing both. Because I look at the cohesion is a two-way road, right? So you have to embrace both host and refugee communities. So because we have great short-term results, we couldn't get the long-term results yet, but even with the great short-term results, the scale-up work is going on, and I think the program is very likely to be successful at scale too, because it involves very nice, very standard teacher training program, and we will train the trainers for this, and J. Paul is helping us with this, and I think it's going to be successful at scale. In terms of other contexts, like take this and apply to other contexts where we have sudden refugee influx to the classrooms, to the communities, even not sudden. Like think about, I live in Italy, it's classrooms with migrant students continuously, but slowly, much slower than Turkey, flowing in. What can a teacher do? What we show in this research is fostering social skills with a real good guidance, a curricular and pedagogical guidance is possible. It's possible by training the teachers in a very nice way, in an efficient way, giving them an effective curricula that they like, they help design, right? So we show that in this research. So taking this to other contexts with revisions, with adapting the curricula to the local context, I think it's quite possible. Should be tested, but it is quite possible. I think it has a lot of implications for other contexts as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Amna, finally, I want to come to you, and then we will open it up for Q&A, and there are already some great questions in the chat. So Amna, you spoke earlier about the fact that the approach that Community Jameel takes is really thinking about how to collaborate with researchers and grassroots organizations and kind of innovators in trying to bridge the world between research and actionable policy. So can you talk a little bit more about what lessons you think other donors, whether philanthropies or maybe bilateral donors or multilateral donors, can learn in trying to develop more effective humanitarian kind of funding responses and policy responses through this kind of a collaborative approach, especially in conflict settings? So what should other donors be thinking about as well?
Yeah, thanks. I guess, because Community Jameel, we're a funder of science and research, we're limited in how we can respond in these kinds of emergency settings, maybe compared to other donors. And part of, I think, the way we approach it is to really try to find the entry points that we're able to tackle challenges in these types of settings using a science and evidence-based approach. And a big kind of way to, or the main way to do that is to really work with partners to strengthen the evidence base of what works in these kind of fragile contexts. So I think a big part of it is to really invest in understanding how these types of interventions work, why they work, and how they can be scaled and replicated. And I think for us, we don't pretend to know everything about, we realize that we are oftentimes 1 or 2 degrees separated from the end kind of, the end users or the end beneficiaries. And so we do want to kind of make sure that we not only rely on our partners to be our eyes and ears and kind of help us understand what's happening on the ground, but also work with different types of partners to ensure that our investments lead to lasting change. And so, like you said, collaboration and partnership is really at the core of how we do this. And we believe in the power of the ecosystem. And in order to ensure sustainability, we really do have to engage with multiple types of stakeholders. The research, the research and the implementation partners is a core part of that, but the policy partner is, I think, equally important. Not only does each partner bring in their unique perspective, but I think that especially working with the policy partners is how we kind of see the ability to achieve scale, impact at scale. And so if, I guess our strategic way of doing this is to think that if we're able to create the enabling conditions to achieve scalable impact, we trigger what in the business world is called the Flywheel Effect. And essentially it's kind of like doing smaller, maybe piloted interventions and kind of test and grow kind of the evidence base and understand more and have more research and bring in more results. And then you'll see that at some point there's kind of a critical mass of evidence that's achieved where more people are going to get behind this and more and more and more, and then it starts kind of it reaches a momentum where you don't have to do anything anymore and it kind of flies by itself, and that's the flywheel effect. And I think that's what we try to achieve with all of our programs, is to be able to kind of anchor, let's say, or seed fund initiatives, build the evidence base around them, and then kind of bring in funding partners to achieve that impact scale, but then also work with the policy partner and the government stakeholders to embed these types of programs into the core ways of policy, into policy. And I think that that's part of the role that philanthropy can play, is really making sure that sometimes there are, and especially this is the case in fragile contexts, but almost in all contexts, it's really hard to try something innovative. But if the philanthropy can come in, or if the other donors can come in and build that evidence base, then it is in a place where I think government partners are a lot more comfortable taking it in and adopting it and scaling it. And so I think that's the lesson that we've learned over God knows how many years, is that we really want to make sure that we achieve that flywheel effect, and we're able to create a program that can run without without our need to kind of continuously fund it and make it sustainable that way.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Amna. So at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to shift to questions from the audience. So to get us started, I will pull out some questions from the Q&A, and if other participants have questions that they want to raise verbally, I think you should have the raise hand feature, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. If not, maybe like just type your question in the chat. Okay, so this question goes out to all of the panelists, so I'll invite you to just unmute if you want to jump in. So one of our audience members says that addressing trauma and violent conflict clearly is a pretty common thread across all of the comments from the panelists. So can you talk a bit about what work either you've done or work that you are aware of where a lens such as gender or race has also been taken into account when designing programs that address trauma?
Anyone particular?
Yes.
Oh,
I can mention something. No, go ahead, Rifat.
No, I was asking if you have any particular audience. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think that absolutely there's a the IRC does a lot of work on, in particular, trauma that so there's, you can kind of separate between past trauma and present trauma, and so of course a lot of experiences of displacement not only include coming from a traumatic place, but also experiencing trauma in the host location, whether inside the household or through discrimination on the streets. So we've definitely found that a lot. It's what's led us to really work a lot with non-Syrian refugees in Jordan, that when we have been doing our focus group discussions around distress, it's absolutely impossible to separate that from current experiences of discrimination and violence in the outside the home. And so it is an enormous area of work. Within the IRC, we have a program in women's protection that is a staged process of helping women become economically independent, and combined with therapy and counseling and violence prevention sort of interventions. There definitely look up what IRC has done in terms of protection work and research as well.
And Rifat, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Eva was said. I would just say that in our refugee crisis, Rohingya refugee crisis, I mean, as I said, we are working in multiple sectors, but we have tried to mainstream mental health in all the sectors, be it in education, health, and social protection. When it comes to health, usually we are looking mental health from more health, a clinical point of view. I'm doing the psychosocial first aid and other counseling and other sessions. When it comes to protection, we have our social workers working there, and we have a lot of mental health psychosocial support going to the children survivors of violence and other sex abuses that the children are facing. Even in education, we have a strong component of mental health by having very interactive learning methodology, which is focused on mental health issues so that they can really learn quickly with a much joyful environment, and also looking at their traumatic experiences that they have faced earlier. So as I'm saying is that basically we have tried to mainstream mental health across all the sectoral interventions that we are doing in Cox's Bazar for the Rohingya.
Great, thanks both. If neither of the other panelists want to jump in on that one, we can shift to another of the questions that came from the audience. So I think this is one, Rifat, that we'll certainly want to hear from you on, but invite others to also jump in here. So what should be done in fragile environments such as the Rohingya situation, where people are not willing to admit or to openly signal certain identities because of potential risks or penalties associated with that? Is there some non-risky signaling method that exists in fragile environments that could enable people to identify that they might need some assistance, or that could be used in normal settings by, say, people from the LGBTQ community? So getting at some of those kind of subgroup identities, we're talking broadly about a whole community of refugees, but there might be some subpopulations that are particularly, at risk.
Right. I'm not sure what exactly the signaling methods you're referring to, the audience is referring to. I'm not particularly sure about that. But in terms of identification, certainly it's always a big challenge, especially when it comes to disability or it comes to LGBTQ. Certainly there is a tendency to conceal their identity in those cases, and certainly we need to take very extra caution on doing that. In my initial deliberation, also I highlighted that we need to have a robust needs assessment processes, which are not always there. But Save the Children is doing that, and we have some, I would say, separate interventions for identifying the persons with disabilities, because there are technical questions that needs to be asked to really identify different disability situations and circumstances. Similarly, for other even violence issues, also sometimes it's very difficult to identify whether there is a case of domestic violence or people really don't want to conceal those things, and especially in a culture like Bangladesh or South Asia, we are a bit of conservative, so where usually we don't want to open up enough to discuss all those things. So we use different tactics, because we have community workers, we have female workers, male workers. So we try to use those mechanisms to really identify, work with them closely, interact with them, and try to get as much information as possible so that we can really make informed programming design in terms of reaching out to those people. And when we're talking about whole community, certainly there are certain interventions that are meant for whole community, but also we take targeted approach for different communities, be it for disabilities, be it for LGBTQ, and be it for other marginalized communities. Definitely we need to do some targeted approach depending on their needs and depending on the data that we have, disaggregated data that we have. So we need to take those, we do take those approaches for different communities.
And Rifat, can I ask you there, could you very briefly, just in like less than a minute, give one example of, if through a needs assessment you identify a particular additional vulnerability, what is an example of the kind of additional support or response that would be directed?
Let's take an example of person with disability. So depending on that person's needs, definitely we need to look at the shelter. The way we develop the shelter, definitely we need to have defined shelter mechanisms, or even for the wash facilities that we are providing. Certainly we need to take into consideration that we need to have a defined design for a physical disability. So whenever we identify some people in that particular category for disability, for example, definitely we need to really revise the whole program design, as I just gave an example of shelter, wash facilities, or even our education, for example. So definitely we need to have different setup for that.
Great. Did anyone else want to comment on that question?
I mean, I'll just.
Sorry, can I say something? So this is, for of course, every situation requires different response, but I like to share my experience with in the field when we are dealing with children in the classroom setting. One of the things that came out and that helped us design the curriculum is that nobody wanted really any ethnicity or any other visible the future of a human being salient. So that was the thing, that one of the things that we got was the complaint from teachers saying that international institutions come, for example, they come into the classrooms and single out the refugee children and to give them something. It's not like something, not something negative, but just kind of singling them out in some way, positive or negative, doesn't matter, generally positive anyways. But that's it. Anybody who knows a little bit about children, this is a deadly thing for children. They don't want that. They really hate that. So one of the things that we got as a feedback was this: if you want to do something for these children, just don't make them think where they come from. Make them think who they want to be, right? And where they are now. So all these things were important in designing this program. And I think it worked really well. We didn't make any ethnicity or any other future salient in this program. And then we saw these beautiful friendships forming, inter-ethnic friendships forming. I think this is important, but of course, this is a different context. This is the context that we are working in classrooms, right? So in another context, somebody might have to signal their ethnicity to get help, for example, when we respond in a kind of a protection sense. So I just wanted to add that.
Eva, last point from you, and then I think I'll wrap up as we're approaching time.
Okay, I'll just say, I think especially for if we're talking about subgroups within a community, I think they will already be signaling something in some way. And so I would, again, not to be like beating the drum of the sort of design perspective, but the way that we should we shouldn't be creating signals. We should be looking for what signals are already there. And I also really think that, I mean, this is very old humanitarian intervention, but safe spaces are very important. And you can have safe spaces for these sort of subgroups that are identified in the community. And in all likelihood, they, again, will already have created their own safe spaces. So building on and strengthening what they've already done is also a good, approach.
Great. Okay. I wish that we had more time for discussion, but I think that's maybe a good place to wrap it up. So I'll offer maybe just a few parting reflections that I'm sure will be inadequate given like kind of the richness of what each of these panelists has mentioned. I think picking up on Eva's last point, I think one of the big messages that's emerging from all of these is that none of us independently kind of are the experts. We have roles to play, but there's also a lot that we don't know, that working in partnership can help us to reveal more blind spots, but also being cognizant of like who's not in the room and not like in this conversation right now, and how actually, important they are to the design and delivery of programming. So first, humility and awareness of those things, I think is coming across pretty strongly. Linked to that, I think something that we've heard from everyone here today is the importance of qualitative work being led oftentimes by the people who are in the classroom, the people who have already created their own sort of ad hoc safe spaces, the needs assessments in the case of the Save the Children approach. So qualitative work to design programs, absolutely critical. Finding ways of building in feedback around like what's actually happening, what's your experience, what's working, and finding ways to genuinely be able to kind of hear and respond to that comes across really clearly in terms of kind of core approaches. As one of the questions from the audience raised, I think trauma and just the growing recognition of the importance of trauma as a cross-cutting like kind of consequence of experiencing fragility, violence, conflict, and how important it is that we be incorporating that more and more into programs. The interesting opportunity that, again, I think it's probably not an accident that talking about the classroom came up several times in today's conversation, that there's a really interesting and important opportunity to try to do more on the platform that is, getting kids into the school, even in complex situations, but also not necessarily veering away from some traditional approaches. The importance of things like safe spaces, the importance of keeping our eyes on durable solutions for return is really critical. And ultimately, I think the overall, the panel brings together people from a diverse set of different stakeholders and organizations. And I think we are enthusiastic about the fact that when we bring these perspectives together, we're seeing sort of more effective and potentially and hopefully more scalable approaches that we can be taking in the future. So with that, I want to thank you all for being with us online and on Zoom, and a huge thank you to our 4 terrific panelists today. We really appreciated all of your insights, and thanks for taking the time to be with us. I don't know if there's anything else that the Belong hosts wanted you to close us out, but that's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Alison. And a huge thank you to all our panelists for being here and for such a rich discussion. There's so much food for thought that I'm sure we'll be going over as we head back today. To all our attendees, thank you so much for staying with us, and that too to 8 p.m. on a weekday. We're really grateful to have you, and we'd be very grateful to have you tomorrow as well. We have extremely exciting sessions lined up for this entire week. And tomorrow we have 4 sessions planned on 2 tracks, actually. We have an amazing conversation with Shashank Avasthi, who will be talking about impact investing and disability inclusion. This will be happening from 5 to 6 p.m. on the track 2 link. On the track 1 link from 6 p.m. onwards, we'll be having JPAL South Asia host with us, Gender Mainstreaming, Centering Women in Policy Making, where we have a whole host of amazing speakers who will be shedding light on this topic. And on track 2, at the same time, that is from 6 to 7:30 p.m., we'll be having conversations around how we can make climate change programs more inclusive, which will be moderated by a partner and regional director for Asia, Dalberg Advisors, Gaurav Gupta. And we'll be ending the day from 8:30 to 9:30 with a panel titled How Can Global Education Programs Be Made More Inclusive? So we look forward to having you all with us. We're also excited to share that Another, spelled UNOTHER, which belongs short format literary content mobile app focused on diversity and inclusion for South Asian audiences, is now live on Google Play Store. You can download the app now to get access to high quality book summaries, interviews, local reading groups with content on feminism, gender and sexuality, race, caste, disability, faith, and so on. And there are a range of subscription plans and promo codes that you can choose from. We will soon be launching the features such as events and podcasts, and we do invite you to take a look at it. And there is an exclusive 20% discount for attendees of the xSDG UnConference, for which I will be pasting the code below. We look forward to having you all with us tomorrow. Thank you so much. Please check out the schedule for the xSDG UnConference for the coming week, and we hope to have a good night ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.